What happens when one of the world's most dangerous choke points suddenly becomes the center of a global showdown? And what if the country trying to shut it down miscalculates the response by a mile? If you want sharp breakdowns like this without the noise, tap like, subscribe, and share this video. Share this video with one friend who follows global power moves. For a moment, it looked like the Strait of Hormuz could go dark. Oil routes, cargo lanes, naval patrols, insurance markets, energy prices. Everything was on edge. Because this was never just about one narrow stretch of water. It was about control, about pressure, about whether a regional power could squeeze the world and get away with it. And when Iran moved to close the Strait of Hormuz, the message was simple. They wanted leverage. They wanted fear. They wanted every government, every shipping company, and every military command center on the planet to stop and ask the same question. How far could this go? But the answer that came back was not hesitation. It was force. Fast, organized, and overwhelming force. The kind of response that does not begin with speeches. It begins with aircraft in the dark, with ships already in motion, with radar screens lighting up, with target lists prepared before the headlines even caught up. And that is why this moment matters so much. Because if you only saw the surface, you might think this was just another exchange of threats in the Gulf, another cycle of statements, missiles, warnings, and denials. But if you look closer, this was a test of something much bigger. A test of whether the global economy can be held hostage by one strategic choke point. A test of whether military deterrence still works when everyone is watching in real time. And a test of whether Iran understood the scale of the risk it was taking. To understand why the response was so fierce, you first have to understand the water itself. The Strait of Hormuz is not just important. It is vital. It is one of the narrowest corridors on Earth. A huge share of the world's oil and gas passes through it. Tankers move through it. Container ships move through it. Naval forces monitor it. Traders obsess over it. Governments plan around it. If that route is blocked, delayed, mined, or threatened, the effects do not stay local. They spread across markets, ports, fuel costs, inflation, and diplomacy. A shock there does not stay in the Gulf. It travels. So when Iran signaled that the strait could be shut, it was not a minor move. It was a direct challenge to the entire system built around freedom of navigation. And Iran knows exactly what that means. This was not an accident. This was strategy. Iran has spent years building an asymmetric playbook for moments like this, not because it can outmatch the United States in a straight conventional war. It cannot. But because it believes it can create pain cheaply. Fast attack boats, coastal missile batteries, sea mines, armed drones, shore-based radar, proxy pressure, electronic harassment. All of it is designed to turn geography into a weapon. Iran does not need to sink half the global fleet to create panic. It only needs to convince the world that shipping the next cargo is no longer worth the risk. That is how choke point warfare works. The threat becomes part of the weapon. Insurance premiums spike, ships reroute, prices rise, nervous leaders start making phone calls, and the country creating the danger hopes everyone else will blink first. That was the gamble. But the gamble had a fatal weakness. It assumed the United States would respond slowly. It assumed Washington would spend critical hours debating optics while the pressure built. It assumed naval escort and diplomatic language would come before decisive strikes. And if that was the assumption, it was disastrous. Because once the closure move was paired with direct danger to maritime traffic, the crisis changed shape. This was no longer about rhetoric. This was about whether commercial shipping could pass safely through an international waterway. That is the line. And once that line is crossed, the military logic becomes brutally clear. Neutralize the systems making the threat credible. Not later. Now. That means radar sites. That means drone launch positions. That means anti-ship missile batteries. That means command nodes, ammunition depots, targeting networks, surveillance assets, and fast boat staging areas. The goal is not symbolic punishment. The goal is operational blindness. Take away the eyes, take away the launchers, take away the confidence, make it impossible to sustain the threat. And that appears to be exactly what followed. The response was not one dramatic explosion and a press conference. It was a campaign, layered, sequenced, deliberate. The kind of campaign built to break capability, not just send a message. First comes the race for awareness. Who sees what first? Who can identify active threats from decoys? Who can separate propaganda from real military movement? In a confrontation like this, the battle starts before the strike. Intelligence aircraft are watching. Satellites are watching. Drones are watching. Naval sensors are watching. Analysts are comparing movement patterns, emissions, and launch behavior. Every vehicle leaving a site matters. Every radar that powers on matters. Every signal burst matters. Then comes suppression. This is where the military machine shows its depth. Stealth platforms, carrier aviation, land-based aircraft, destroyers, submarines, drones, and electronic warfare all become part of one larger design. Some assets find, some jam, some escort, some strike, some wait for the second wave. It is never just one branch. It is never just one platform. It is coordination. And coordination is what makes the difference between a dramatic raid and a real degrading campaign. If Iran tried to turn the strait into a kill zone, the United States had every reason to turn Iran's coastal threat belt into a liability. Because fixed launchers can be found, supply depots can be mapped, known naval facilities can be watched, patterns can be built over time. And when the order comes, years of preparation suddenly compress into hours. That is the part many people miss. The visible response may look sudden. The invisible preparation usually is not. Plans for a Hormuz crisis do not get invented overnight. They sit in war rooms, simulation models, and command networks, and contingency binders for years. Routes are studied, threat libraries are updated, commanders rehearse options, pilots train for hostile air defense environments, naval crews practice layered defense and escort procedures. Because if this moment ever comes, hesitation is expensive. And that explains why the opening response can feel almost unreal. One night, threats dominate the conversation. The next night, launch sites are burning, communications nodes go silent. Patrol craft disappear from the picture. The side that thought geography gave it control starts learning. Geography can also trap you, especially if your most important military assets sit near the coast, exposed to surveillance, and dependent on a fragile network of communications and logistics. That is where the deeper tension sits. Iran's whole strategy around Hormuz depends on making the water feel dangerous. America's strategy depends on making that danger unsustainable. One side wants prolonged uncertainty. The other wants rapid dominance. One side thrives on gray zone pressure. The other responds by forcing the confrontation into a domain where its military advantages are overwhelming. And once that transition happens, the balance can shift very fast. Think about the practical chain reaction. A ship is attacked, threatened, or forced off route. Markets react. Military escorts tighten. Surveillance increases. Threat emitters are tracked. The rules of engagement change. Then the response expands. What looked like a maritime pressure play becomes a wider air and naval campaign. And now the side that wanted leverage is suddenly trying to protect dispersed, vulnerable assets across a long coastline. That is a bad trade, a very bad trade. Because the United States does not need to occupy Iran to break this specific threat. It only needs to reduce Iran's ability to interfere with shipping at an acceptable level. That means degrading enough launch capacity, enough coordination, enough detection capability, and enough confidence that ships can keep moving under protection. That is a very different objective from regime change. It is narrower, more realistic, and in military terms, more achievable. Still, none of this is simple. A campaign like this comes with danger on every side. Iran still has options. Even after heavy strikes, it can fire missiles, it can launch drones, it can mine approaches, it can use proxies, it can threaten regional bases, it can try cyber disruption, it can target energy infrastructure beyond the strait. That is what makes this kind of crisis so tense. You can crush part of the spear without ending the fight. And every new strike creates pressure for the next response. That is why commanders care so much about sequence. You do not just hit targets. You hit the right targets in the right order. Blind the sensors. Disrupt the command chain. Destroy munitions, where possible. Break the launch rhythm. Cover shipping. Protect allied bases. Prepare for retaliation. Then repeat. If you're still with me, hit the subscribe button now, drop a comment with your prediction. And send this to someone who loves serious geopolitical breakdowns without the fluff. And if the response we are talking about unfolded at scale, that would explain why it felt so massive so quickly. Because once the decision is made to keep Hormuz open by force, half measures are risky. If you strike too little, the threat remains. If you move too slowly, the uncertainty spreads. If you protect shipping without degrading the threat network, you create a permanent emergency. So the logic becomes hard and cold. Hit enough, fast enough, and accurately enough that the closure attempt collapses. That is what a military system like this is built to do. And there is another layer here that matters just as much. Psychology. Wars are fought with explosives, yes, but they are also fought with perception. Iran wanted to project control. It wanted tankers, investors, and governments to believe it could dictate the terms of passage. The United States had to destroy that image, not just physically, but mentally. Every successful escorted transit matters. Every failed Iranian attempt matters. Every radar site lost matters. Every surviving commercial convoy matters. Because the true battle is not only over water, it is over confidence. If global shipping believes the route remains open under protection, Iran loses leverage even before it loses every platform. And that is why the wording from both sides matters so much. Each side is trying to define reality before the full outcome is settled. Iran says it can close the route. America says it cannot. Iran says foreign ships move under Iranian shadow. America says international passage will continue. Iran wants the fear to spread first. America wants normal traffic to resume first. Whoever shapes expectations gains momentum. And momentum in a crisis like this can be priceless. Now, let's talk about what a closure attempt really says about Iran's position. Countries resort to extreme leverage when they feel boxed in, pressured, or cornered. Closing Hormuz is not the move of a state that feels calm and secure. It is the move of a state trying to remind the world that it still has teeth, that it can still raise the cost, that even if it cannot dominate the region outright, it can make disorder expensive. This is coercion, strategic coercion. Like all coercive strategies, it depends on credibility. The moment your threat fails, your position weakens. Worse, if your threat triggers a stronger response than expected. You can lose both capability and prestige at the same time. That is the nightmare scenario for any regime. It is one thing to threaten closure. It is another thing to threaten closure and then watch your launch infrastructure get torn apart, while the shipping lane stays alive. That is not strength. That is exposure. And exposure is dangerous for a system that survives on image as much as force. Inside Iran, the leadership cannot look weak. Regionally, it cannot look ineffective. Internationally, it wants to look unavoidable. So even when the military costs rise, the political temptation to keep escalating remains. That is what makes this so volatile. There is always a gap between what is militarily smart and what is politically survivable. Sometimes leaders know a move is costly. They make it anyway because backing down feels even worse. That is how narrow crises become wider ones. And that brings us to the American side of the equation. For Washington, this is not just about one enemy action. It is about precedent. If a state can seriously threaten one of the most important shipping lanes on Earth and force the world to adjust around it, then deterrence takes a direct hit. Allied confidence drops. Rivals learn. Markets panic faster next time. Insurance costs stay elevated. Regional partners start doubting American guarantees. That is why keeping the lane open matters. It is a message to allies. It is a message to competitors. And it is a message to every actor watching. Whether the United States still has both the will and the ability to enforce basic freedom of navigation under fire. In other words, if Washington had responded weakly here, the damage would not have ended at Hormuz. It would have echoed into the Red Sea, the South China Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and beyond. That is why the response had to be sharp, not reckless, not random. Sharp, designed to restore deterrence before hesitation turned into a larger strategic loss. There is also a military truth. Sea control is not just about ships. It is about the entire system around the sea. The coast matters. The airspace matters. The electromagnetic spectrum matters. The logistics chain matters. If you dominate those layers, you can make a narrow waterway function. If you lose those layers, the sea becomes dangerous even without a formal blockade. So when people picture this crisis, they should not imagine only ships staring at each other across open water. They should imagine a giant invisible contest of detection, timing, coordination, communications, targeting, and endurance. That is the real battlefield. And endurance matters more than drama. Anyone can launch a threat. The harder question is, who can sustain operations under pressure? Who can replace losses? Who can protect logistics? Who can keep pilots flying, escorts moving, analysts working, defenses active, and commercial flows alive day after day? That is where military asymmetry becomes brutally visible. Iran can create danger quickly. The United States can manage and degrade that danger over time with far greater depth. That does not mean no risk. It means the longer the direct contest stays focused on keeping the strait open, the harder the math becomes for Iran, unless Iran can produce a truly shocking disruption. Its leverage starts decaying the moment its threat systems are consistently hunted. And then there is the economic side. Even a short-lived Hormuz crisis sends tremors everywhere. Energy traders react instantly. Governments start planning for price shocks. Shipping firms review routes and risk exposure. Consumers far away end up feeling the consequences through fuel and goods. That is why so many crises in this region feel bigger than the map suggests. The map is small, the impact is global. A narrow channel of water can shake entire economies. That is exactly why it is so tempting as a pressure point. And exactly why the world cannot afford to let a closure attempt stand uncontested. But there's a hard question hiding underneath all of this. What counts as success? Is success destroying every launcher? Probably not. Is success ending every threat forever? Also no. The more realistic definition is narrower. Keep enough traffic moving. Protect enough vessels. Reduce enough Iranian capability. Restore enough confidence. Deter the next move. Success in a crisis like this is rarely perfect. It is measured in whether the strategic objective failed. If Iran set out to close the strait and impose its own terms, then the central question is simple. Did shipping stop? Did the world accept Iranian control? Or did traffic continue under overwhelming counterforce? That is the scoreboard that matters. And if the answer is that the route stayed alive, even under stress, then Iran triggered the outcome it feared most. A direct demonstration that its most important coercive card can be blunted. That would be a major blow, not just materially, but psychologically and politically. Because once a threat is tested and partially broken, it becomes harder. Markets remember, navies adapt, partners prepare. The myth of uncontested local control starts to crack. Still, nobody should pretend this ends neatly. Even if the immediate closure attempt fails, the aftermath can stay dangerous. Retaliation can spread, proxy attacks can intensify, cyber operations can expand, regional diplomacy can harden, and every side will try to rewrite the narrative. Iran will claim resilience. America will claim restored freedom of navigation. Observers will argue over damage, escalation, and intent. That is normal. The fog after confrontation is contested. But some realities cut through the fog. If ships keep moving, that matters. If threat networks go dark, that matters. If launch sites are destroyed, that matters. If regional actors recalibrate, that matters. And if one country tried to close the artery of global energy and failed, that matters most of all. By this point, the biggest lesson may be the simplest one. Geography gives power, but geography does not guarantee victory. A choke point can be a weapon. It can also become a trap for the side that overplays it. Iran tried to turn location into leverage. The United States answered by turning leverage into vulnerability. That is the real story here. Not just that a threat was made, but that the threat invited a response, built to dismantle the very systems that made the threat possible. And once that cycle begins, the side that depends on intimidation has to confront the most dangerous outcome of all. Not defeat in one moment, but erosion. Slow, relentless erosion of capability, credibility, and control. If this breakdown is giving you a clearer picture, share it now, save it for later, and tell me below which move changed the whole crisis in your view. So where does this go next? There are really only a few paths. The first is controlled de-escalation. Iran absorbs the damage, keeps the rhetoric high, but reduces direct interference enough to avoid a larger war. That path lets everyone claim partial victory. It lowers immediate risk, and it gives diplomacy room to breathe, but it also requires discipline. And discipline is hard when prestige has been wounded. The second path is prolonged pressure. Not full war, but repeated cycles of harassment, escort, interception, and selective strikes. This is the grinding middle ground. No one fully backs down. No one fully commits. The crisis becomes a recurring emergency. That may be the most realistic path if neither side wants total escalation, but neither side wants to look weak. The third path is expansion. More regional assets get hit. More proxies enter the picture. Energy infrastructure becomes a target set. Missile exchanges widen. The geography of the crisis grows larger than Hormuz itself. That is the path every planner avoids. Because once conflict spills outward, control becomes harder for everyone. History is full of leaders who thought they could manage. So the next moves matter immensely. Does Iran keep testing the boundary? Does the United States widen the target list? Do regional partners step up more openly? Do commercial shippers regain confidence, or do they remain cautious, even under escort? These are not side questions. They are the questions that decide whether this becomes a short episode or a long confrontation. But no matter what comes next, one reality is already impossible to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz is still dangerous, and every crisis there forces the same ancient truth back into modern headlines. Trade routes are never just about trade. They are about power, who protects them, who threatens them, who pays for them, and who suffers when they break. That is why the world watches this strip of water so closely. That is why markets panic when missiles move. That is why navies train for years over miles of sea most people will never see. Because in that narrow corridor, global stability can rise or fall with terrifying speed. And that is why Iran's move was so dangerous, not only because it challenged a shipping lane, but because it challenged the idea that the world's critical arteries can remain open when coercion meets resistance. The American response, at least in logic, was meant to answer that challenge with unmistakable force, not with vague warnings, not with symbolic gestures, with action designed to prove that the strait could be defended, the threat could be punished, and the gamble could fail. Whether that lesson lasts is another question. Deterrence is never permanent. It has to be renewed, again and again. That is the exhausting truth of places like Hormuz. No victory there is ever final. Only temporary, only managed, only maintained through strength, clarity, and constant readiness. And maybe that is the most chilling part of this entire story. The world depends on routes so fragile. That one desperate move can shake continents. One closure threat can rattle markets. One night of strikes can redraw calculations. One misread signal can push rivals into a confrontation neither truly controls. That is the razor's edge. That is what makes this more than just a military episode. It is a reminder that the global system is vulnerable. And when calm breaks, the response is shaped by whoever is fastest, sharpest, and most prepared to act. This time, Iran tried to force the question. And the United States answered it in the language great powers use. When they decide a strategic route will not be surrendered. The final message was bigger than one battle map. If you try to choke the world through Hormuz, expect the blowback to come hard, fast, and without illusions. That is why this story matters. That is why the next move matters. And that is why everyone from sailors to presidents will keep watching that narrow strip of water like the future is passing through it. Because in many ways it is.